I never considered myself particularly superstitious, but there's something captivating about ancient myths. Something that can lodge in the soul and come alive at the mere mention of them. Among the myriad legends of indigenous peoples I've encountered, the Navajo tales of skinwalkers have always held a special place. Secret sorcerers capable of transforming into animals, assuming the appearances of others, and skillfully deceiving even the most cautious. I used to think such stories were nothing more than scary tales told to frighten children. But the more I read about these old tribes, the more I realized that every legend has its roots in reality, and that this fear is built on a solid foundation. Among the records I discovered in the archives were grim accounts of people who vanished without a trace in the deserts and canyons of New Mexico. The Navajo always attributed these events to an unknown force. Their shamans claimed that certain chosen, or cursed, individuals could don the skins of wolves, coyotes, bears, and even mimic human forms. Such a skinwalker was not only physically dangerous, but also possessed a sort of hypnotic aura capable of paralyzing its victim. They spoke of glowing eyes and inhuman cries echoing in the night desert, sowing panic in the hearts of travelers. I read these stories with bated breath, feeling goosebumps along my spine, even as my mind insisted it was all just folklore. Yet my inner curiosity eventually overpowered my fear. I had longed for a truly wild vacation under a starry sky, and when the opportunity arose to journey through New Mexico with a group of friends, I didn't hesitate. Our final destination was the Pecos Wilderness area, part of the Santa Fe National Forest. According to seasoned travelers, there were little explored trails, turquoise lakes hidden among lush coniferous groves, and wild mountain streams carving their way through the rocks. At night, an unforgettable spectacle was promised. Millions of stars visible away from city lights and complete silence broken only by the soft whistle of the wind. Being someone who loves to plan meticulously, I set about preparing thoroughly, poring over maps, reading reviews, watching videos in which experienced travelers warned about the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather. I paid special attention to the old legends of skinwalkers. Of course, it all seemed absurd, yet the thought of such creatures would not leave me. It stirred my imagination. The situation was further fueled by local forums featuring reports from alarmed eyewitnesses describing eerie encounters with something unnatural. Most of these accounts were dismissed as mere children's tales, but everyone mentioned an almost mystical detail: glowing eyes. According to one version, they always burned with a cold orange light. Another claimed they shone red, and yet another said yellow. Everyone swore they'd seen that inhuman flash in the dark. Nevertheless, my rational side prevailed. I decided that all this only added some color and nothing more. My gear was ready: a tent, a warm sleeping bag, a water filter, a fire-starting kit, some medicines, and a couple of knives. I carefully chose a comfortable backpack, planned our meals, and mapped out our stops. The group was experienced, yet no one doubted that for safety, every little detail had to be accounted for. I scrutinized the weather reports. After all, it can be quite hot in New Mexico during the day, while at night the temperature can drop sharply. The day of departure arrived, and I still felt a conflicting thrill, whether from the impending adventure or the nagging thought that the Skinwalker stories might be more than mere fiction. As we drove away, I found myself unable to tear my eyes from the landscape outside the car window. The endless expanses of the desert gradually gave way to rising mountain ranges in the distance. The air was dry, and the sky appeared unusually deep. The silence that enveloped us at each stop seemed to hint that something more awaited us than a simple nature hike. We were ready for nights under the open sky, long treks, and even a lack of cell service. Yet none of us expected to come face to face with an ancient primordial threat, awakened by the old magic of the Navajo. When we reached the starting point of our route, the bright sun hung high in a cloudless sky. The surrounding landscapes were striking in their contrast. From one angle, it seemed the desert lay far below, while around us, mountains rose with pine-clad slopes and green meadows. Signs indicated we were in the Pecos Wilderness, a specially protected area of pristine nature. Stepping onto the soft ground of this region, you feel as though you're returning to a time when man was not the master of the land. My friends and I began our ascent along a narrow trail. Massive coniferous trees surrounded us, allowing bright beams of sunlight to filter through rare openings. The wind rustled softly through the branches, and it almost felt as if the forest was whispering its secrets. Deep down, I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere nearby, those very creatures I had read about might be lurking. Yet those thoughts were more of a vague unease than a conscious fear. I forced myself to focus on the beauty of the world around me. After several hours of hiking, we reached a small plateau offering a picturesque view of a deep canyon, its walls lined with cedars and pines from bottom to top. Beyond the canyon, in the distance, white peaks loomed over the landscape. According to our plan, there were several crystal-clear mountain lakes there. We agreed to set up camp by one of them for 2 or 3 nights. I felt a pleasant fatigue and a slight tingle in my muscles from climbing uphill. The air here was remarkably fresh, filled with a delicate scent of pine. The descent to the lake went without incident. The water sparkled under the sun, the banks were strewn with smooth stones, and not a soul was in sight. It seemed we were alone in this wild territory. I pitched my tent under the shelter of the pines to protect against the morning sun, and nearby I arranged a spot for a fire, clearing away all the dry twigs and pine needles. The others unpacked the supplies, set up additional tents, and gathered firewood. As the sun began to set and the light softened, the forest seemed to hold its breath. When the fire finally blazed, I went to fetch water from the lake. Its smooth surface resembled a mirror-like film, reflecting the crimson hues of the sky. At that moment, a strange unease washed over me, as if something was trying to whisper from the dark depths of the water. Approaching the rocky shore, I suddenly noticed distinct tracks resembling those of a coyote, yet too large and elongated. They appeared to stretch from the forest right to the water's edge, then vanish. I studied these prints for a while, puzzling over how this could be. The sense of unease grew stronger, but I decided it was probably just the tracks of a large dog or wolf. As I pondered this, the sky above the peaks darkened quickly and the wind turned noticeably cold. I returned to the fire, where in the twilight yellow tongues of flame danced, casting wavering shadows on the tall tree trunks. Before settling into my evening routine, I glanced toward the forest and thought that somewhere deep within the conifer thickets, something might be stirring. But the fading light and the flickering embers revealed no details. Finally, the camp began to take on a complete, organized appearance. There was enough firewood for the entire night, and the tents were pitched at a safe distance from one another. An enveloping, lulling silence reigned, disturbed only by the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustle of branches, reminders that we were not alone in this forest. I noted to myself how easily nature can both embrace and repel a person. We were strangers here, and every shadow and every sound burrowed into our consciousness, a reminder that we were in a wild territory governed by its own unfathomable laws. We settled around the fire, unaware that soon the night's darkness would reveal one of its most terrifying aspects. When it was completely dark, the forest transformed into a black labyrinth of silence and indistinct shapes, with the fire serving as our only source of warmth and light. I sat, leaning against a stone, watching sparks burst from the flames and shoot upward, only to dissolve into the endless darkness. The interplay of light and the quiet sounds of nature were soothing, yet I couldn't relax. Inside, a persistent anxiety stirred, as if the forest itself were trying to warn me. It felt as though a foreign presence permeated the air. I tried to convince myself that my mind was simply conjuring fears amid all those Skinwalker stories I'd reread before the trip. But by night, all those tales seemed to take on a new life, pulsing somewhere at the edge of my consciousness. I recalled the details of the legends, of sorcerers donning animal skins, mimicking any voice or appearance, and of eyes whose light could terrify any living creature. And though I hadn't heard any clear evidence of another's presence, my instincts warned me that we were not alone. Eventually, a long, mournful howl of a coyote split the forest, a sound that in itself would not be unusual, since coyotes are common here. Yet this howl carried something unnatural, unlike ordinary wildlife calls, a sharp, almost grating summons that echoed off the mountains. My heart clenched and a chill ran down my neck. I looked around and saw that my companions had also tensed up, though no one spoke. We were together, yet the solitude of the night forest felt especially acute. After a while, the howl came again, but this time closer. Then, through the flickering light of the fire, I caught sight of a pair of bright eyes flaring in the shadows between the trees. They burned with an unusual, fiery yellow glow and lingered on us for a moment. Was it a coyote? A cold fear seized my chest. The creature appeared too tall, its silhouette hinting at something larger, though I couldn't make out the details. The eyes vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, and silence fell once more. While the fire still burned, I decided to check that everything was in order. I inspected our supplies, ensured the backpacks were securely closed, and walked along the perimeter of the camp. Every rustle made me jump, and I strained my eyes in the dense darkness. In the beam of my flashlight, I suddenly thought I saw movement on a slope about 15 meters from camp. I stopped, my heart pounding. Yet I couldn't discern anything specific, only a chilling fear, reinforced by the Skinwalker stories, reminding me that danger could lurk behind any tree. With anxiety weighing on me, I returned to the fading fire. The evening chatter had died down. No one spoke their fears aloud, but the tension was palpable even without words. I gazed into the dancing flames, wondering if we had made a mistake by choosing such an isolated hike. Sometimes, night forests can be peaceful and calming, but tonight everything warned. Don't let your guard down. The distant barking and howling of coyotes along the trail only intensified our nervous tension. It wasn't long before it was time to sleep, yet it felt that once we extinguished the fire and retreated to our tents, the darkness would press in tighter and give way to something far more ominous. Deep down, I hoped that dawn would bring relief and dispel all doubts. However, the heavy weight of the unknown, like a black cloud, pressed upon my mind. Before climbing into my tent, I cast one last glance at the dark outline of the forest where at times pale fireflies flickered. For a moment it seemed that something peeked out from behind a thick tree trunk, a silhouette too tall to belong to a coyote. But no sound followed, and I decided it was merely a trick of the light and my imagination. We went to sleep, each in our own tent, yet sleep eluded us. The forest lived its own unfathomable life, and within the thin walls of our tents, everything appeared exponentially scarier. The wind would ebb and surge, and every creak of branches was perceived as an omen of something dreadful. I lay there, clutched in my sleeping bag, listening to my heart pound wildly. It was then that I began to suspect that these ancient legends were not so far removed from reality, and that this very night had only just begun to send its first cautious signals of its presence. The night promised no peace. As I attempted to slip into a brief, troubled sleep, the wind outside continued to murmur, the forest rustled deeply, and somewhere in the distance, solitary cries of unknown creatures echoed. I had barely begun to doze off when I heard a muffled rustling at the entrance to my tent, followed by a heavy, hoarse exhale. Inside, it suddenly grew colder. Something or someone was just a few steps away. I froze, careful not to move or breathe. The rustling repeated. Then came a scraping sound, as if claws were dragging over fabric. For a moment, and then silence. I couldn't tell if it was real or a half-dream, but the fear pierced me like needles. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a scream somewhere in the darkness. It sounded somewhat human, yet horrifyingly distorted. My heart sank to my feet. A second later, there was a dull thud, as if someone had fallen or struggled free from a grip. I sat up abruptly, trying to understand what was happening. Then the night was torn apart by a terrifying howl that escalated into a creaking roar. I had never heard anything like it in my life. It was neither a human cry nor an animal call, but something in between, monstrously eerie. I bolted from my tent, scarcely aware of what I was doing. Stars twinkled above, and the moonlight cast a bleak glow on the surroundings. The fire was nearly out, leaving only smoldering embers that faintly illuminated the trees. Soon, by the light of my flashlight, I saw a shadow flit over a friend's tent. A nightmarish, elongated figure that looked either like a huge coyote standing on its hind legs or a human with unnaturally long limbs. Its eyes flashed a bright yellow before it leapt away into the darkness with incredible speed. The sight was so shocking that I froze, unable to move. Chaotic sounds filled the air. Someone in panic leaped from their tent. Someone else scrambled through the forest with a flashlight, trying to catch sight of the unknown intruder. I saw that the tent near which the creature had appeared was torn apart, with my friend's belongings scattered nearby, but my friend was nowhere in sight. An unpleasant smell filled the air, reminiscent of a mix of charred material and damp fur. Then, from across the lake, that same unnatural howl echoed again, as if the creature had shifted to the opposite shore in mere seconds. I could no longer tell what was really happening. Thoughts of skinwalkers and their demonic abilities whirled through my mind, and I realized I didn't want to face that creature out in the open. Yet running seemed impossible. A night forest, a dangerous creature lurking nearby, and the shock of what was unfolding. Something flitted among the trees, branches snapped frequently, and dull impacts echoed in the darkness. It felt as though not one but several monsters were prowling around. The stories of people disappearing in the night transformed from abstract legends into a terrifying reality. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed a barely perceptible movement behind the nearest tree trunk. Moonlight glided over a pale, hairless paw that transitioned into a long, disproportionate hand. I felt a tightening inside me. The creature emitted that strange guttural sound again and moved deeper into the thicket. I couldn't tell whether it was aware of our presence or simply playing with us like prey. In a desperate impulse, I switched my flashlight to a brighter mode and swept its beam over the spot where I had just seen the silhouette. But the creature had vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind in the pines. The situation resembled a nightmare from which one cannot wake. The dreadful howls repeated several more times, echoing off the mountains. I frantically wondered how quickly we could escape this trap. Yet the darkness held us in its grip, and the unknown creature, as if testing our defenses, repeatedly instilled utter terror. The night seemed endless, and reality itself began to fracture. An unsettling awareness that everything happening was beyond the ordinary filled me with a growing sense of helplessness and numbness. It felt as though the very earth exhaled an ancient magic, rising from the depths of Navajo legends, and we were caught in its deadly snare. When the morning sun's rays finally pierced through the treetops, they brought with them the painful realization of the night's events. We had scarcely slept until dawn, gripped by terror over what had transpired around the camp. As soon as it grew lighter, we quickly gathered our things, feverishly packing up tents and supplies. No one wanted to linger even a minute longer. The air was thick with tension and fear, and the lake, which had appeared so peaceful the previous day, now looked ominous and desolate. Remembering the screams of the night and the flash of yellow eyes sent a cold shiver down my spine. Losing my friend was the hardest blow. He had vanished without a trace, and we couldn't tell whether he was alive or where he might be. At his torn tent, only his tattered belongings remained. We shouted his name several times, knowing no answer would come. Gradually, a horrifying realization set in. There was no point in searching the forest when it itself might hide a terrifying creature, one far superior to man in both speed and cunning. In the end, we decided that the only way out was to run and reach the nearest settlement as quickly as possible. The journey back turned into a torturous sprint. We marched without stopping, barely speaking and constantly looking over our shoulders. It felt as though danger lurked behind every tree. Despite the daylight, the sense of safety never returned. The trees opened up to reveal the same pristine beauty of the Pecos wilderness, but now those views were tinted with the hues of a nightmare. We passed silently by old coyote tracks that, in light of recent events, carried a dreadful significance. After several hours, we reached our vehicle and drove to the nearest town, scarcely uttering a word. The full weight of what had happened began to sink in during the drive as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. At one point, when I saw the first roadside buildings, it felt as if a heavy burden was lifted from my heart. I nearly broke down in tears from relief and overwhelming guilt over my missing friend. We knew we had to call for help and report what had occurred. Yet this presented a new difficulty. How to describe something that even we could not fully explain? How do you talk about a monster that only we had seen and only fleetingly? We chose instead to describe the incident as an attack by a wild animal, perhaps a wolf or a coyote. Deep down, however, I knew that no ordinary animal could have left us alive after all we had witnessed. At the hotel, we finally managed to regain our strength and search the internet for more information on Skinwalkers. The articles that once seemed like mystical ghost stories now echoed the horrors of that night. People recounted accounts of missing persons, strange sounds, and glowing eyes, suggesting that these creatures seemed to feed on the terror of their victims. I read these testimonies and began to understand that it wasn't mere folklore. For generations, the people living on Navajo lands had passed down a tattered chain of stories about cursed shamans capable of shape-shifting and performing unthinkable deeds. We had experienced a brush with that ancient legend firsthand, having crossed a line when we chose to camp in a place where human laws did not apply. Several weeks passed before we finally returned to our homes, scattering to different states and attempting to start our lives anew. Yet each of us carried a constant fear of the unknown in our hearts. The search for our missing friend yielded no answers, and the explanations provided by rescuers remained vague. The official report stated that he was likely taken by a wild animal, but I knew it wasn't an ordinary creature. My inner voice, bolstered by what I had seen and heard, whispered that one should never meddle lightly with the magical boundaries of these lands. Story 2. I've always been someone who prefers to observe and remain silent rather than speak unnecessarily. Perhaps that's why people around me considered me withdrawn or pensive, but in truth, I simply enjoyed noticing details that others overlooked. My name is Amy, and I live in a small town on the east coast of the United States. My family moved here long ago from a larger metropolis in hopes of finding peace and a slower pace of life. Yet sometimes I felt that behind the deceptive calm of this province lay far more unsettling stories. This feeling turned out to be true when my friends and I decided to embark on a 4-day mountain hike. We were a peculiar but tight-knit group. I had known Ashley since school. She always had a knack for a sharp remark and could deflate someone's arrogance with a single sarcastic comment. With her around, I felt safe. She exuded the confidence of 3 people in one. Darrell, on the other hand, was more taciturn but physically the strongest among us. I like to think that beneath his serious exterior and sturdy build lay a gentle heart. Judy was his complete opposite, slight, short, and the youngest of us, yet endowed with a lively mind and optimism that compensated for any physical frailty. I knew that Darrell and Judy were planning to take their relationship to a serious level. Perhaps that was what spurred them to organize a romantic excursion to the mountain summit. Proposing to tie the knot in such a setting seemed epic, though I couldn't shake a growing inner unease about the entire endeavor. We decided to travel in 2 cars so that, if unforeseen circumstances arose, we could split up or leave without waiting for each other. Deep down, however, everyone hoped for an enjoyable hike and unforgettable experiences. The preparations took a couple of days. During that time, we discussed exactly where to go and how to share the load. I took charge of organizing the route, choosing a relatively easy trail so that we could reach the summit in 2 days, camp there, and descend over the next 2 days. The weather was expected to be unusually favorable, dry, rainless, with a gentle breeze. We learned that these mountains rarely hosted tourist groups. The area was renowned for its wildness and almost untouched nature. This only spurred us on as we longed to feel like pioneers. However, as we neared the starting point, strange rumors began to surface. Local residents, upon hearing about our planned route, looked at us with mild bemusement and recounted urban legends, as if some mysterious creatures lurked deep in the forest. No one could clearly explain what these beasts were. Some spoke of giant wolves, others of ghostly deer, and still others mentioned mythical skinwalkers, shapeshifters, capable of altering their appearance. Ashley dismissed such stories as foolish, relying on her rational nature and strong character. Darrell remained silently tense, occasionally glancing at Judy, clearly concerned that these tales might spoil his perfect plan. Judy, trying to hide her unease, merely shrugged with a playful air, though her eyes betrayed her worry, and I couldn't shake an increasing feeling of dread. Just before setting off, we stopped at a small diner to grab a bite and pick up some missing supplies. Gas canisters, a couple of lightweight folding chairs, and an extra tarp. When we returned to the car, I noticed an elderly woman outside, staring directly at us without blinking. Her face expressed such strange worry that I suddenly felt uneasy. I looked away for a second, and when I glanced back where she had been, she was gone. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, but deep down, something told me that something ominous was about to begin, and so we set off, seemingly prepared yet utterly unaware of what awaited us. We reached the foot of the mountain near sunset and immediately sensed a change in the atmosphere. In daylight, the sun's rays and the cool air felt welcoming, but as twilight deepened, everything took on a sinister tint. I felt a tangible tension among us, though no one spoke of it. We exchanged glances, searching for reassurance in each other's eyes as we pressed on. The trail wasn't difficult, but ascending at dusk is always risky, so we decided to take our first break on a small flat clearing near a stream. Darrell helped me quickly set up the tent, while Ashley and Judy headed off to gather firewood. I tried to act confidently, although my heart pounded with a strange sense that we were not alone in the woods. Even though we'd chosen a relatively well-known route, there were no other hikers in sight, not even old fire pits that might indicate frequent human presence in these parts. I couldn't stop thinking about the legends I had heard in town. Deep inside, I hoped they were nothing more than urban myths. The sky overhead was heavy and gray, with only a thin edge of the sunset lit in a pale orange. When we lit the fire, the surrounding trees cast even sharper, eerie shadows. The air was thick with the premonition of a storm, though the rain never came. Ashley returned with a bundle of branches and sat by the fire, trying to appear relaxed, as she idly fiddled with the slender twigs, occasionally tossing them into the flames. In stark contrast, Judy looked visibly on edge, constantly glancing around as if expecting danger to emerge from behind every tree. Darrell did his best to reassure her. I could see in his eyes how determined he was to protect her from any threat. I sat across from them, and everything around us seemed frozen in tense anticipation. Suddenly, a sound emerged from deep within the forest that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I assumed it was merely a coyote's howl, but this sound was much louder and seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was hard to tell whether it was a wail or a screech, and I couldn't recall any natural equivalent. Ashley looked up, as if checking whether I had misheard. Judy returned to the fire, pale, clutching some twigs in her hands, while Darrell blinked as if trying to shake off the uninvited dread. We sat in complete silence for several minutes, the crackling of the fire intermittently breaking the eerie echo of that unknown sound. When the noise repeated and the forest's silence resumed, my pulse throbbed in my temples, and I noticed Darrell's hand involuntarily tighten around the handle of his knife. The fire flared, illuminating our wary faces and the distorted shadows on the ground. We hesitated to venture further into the forest, yet staying put was just as terrifying. A debate broke out over whether we should pack up camp immediately and continue down the mountain under the cover of night, but everyone understood. The trail was dangerous, especially since no one knew what creature might be lurking in the depths. We decided to set up a night watch. Each hour, someone would stay by the fire and patrol a small perimeter to ensure no danger was near. Darrell took the first watch. I lay in my tent, closing my eyes and straining to listen. Amidst the rustle of the wind and the crunch of small twigs under Darrell's steps, I kept hearing that ghastly sound as if a predatory beast was creeping around the camp, waiting for the right moment. Sleep did not come. Instead, dark thoughts of how many people had disappeared in such ominous forests filled my mind, with no one ever really knowing what happened. One might think we were well armed with flashlights, knives, and even a plan, yet deep inside, I felt my own vulnerability and insignificance in the face of an ancient, unknown force. That thought would not let me rest, and I lay there clutching my sleeping bag, listening as the shadows around me whispered. Amid the growing silence, I heard the creak of trees, a prolonged sound, as if someone were squeezing the trunks with gigantic claws. I heard Darryl hold his breath and mutter a muffled curse. I wanted to get out of the tent, but I was afraid to reveal that I too was frightened. Hours passed in this uneasy state until the anxiety became almost unbearable. I realized then that this night was only the beginning of a nightmare that was gathering momentum. Morning found us exhausted and dejected. It felt as though I hadn't slept at all, existing instead in a perpetual half-sleep, listening to every sound. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the treetops, we could no longer bear to remain. Everyone desperately wanted to leave that place. Ashley was the first to suggest that we pack up camp immediately. Normally calm and composed, she now seemed driven by an inner terror that robbed her of rational thought. No one objected. We hurriedly gathered our belongings, stuffing our backpacks in a disorganized rush. Darryl barely managed to take down the tent, his hands trembling despite his efforts to stay composed for Judy's sake. Judy immediately rushed to help me when she noticed I was struggling with the zipper on my backpack. Her eyes were red as if from a night spent awake, haunted by tormenting thoughts. We understood that the descent would be arduous, but none of us wanted to spend another night in that forest. We decided to leave behind the extra gear, the surplus provisions, a couple of folding chairs, and the tarp, and only take what was essential: flashlights, water, knives, and our documents. Everything else seemed trivial when life felt so precarious. I could sense the air vibrating with our tension, and no further words were exchanged. Everyone understood that we had to move as quickly as possible. We quickened our pace along the trail, each step taken with extreme caution. The wet ground could easily betray us and send someone tumbling down. I led the way, as I knew the route better than the others, consulting the map and having a clear idea of how to reach a safe area as swiftly as possible. About an hour into the journey, a sudden terrible piercing howl overwhelmed us. It was louder than the one from the night before. It seemed to sear our eardrums and made our hearts pound as if trying to burst from our chests. I glanced back and saw Judy clutching Darryl's arm, while Ashley squinted for a moment, as if hoping that by closing her eyes, she could wake from a horrible dream. The sound repeated, this time accompanied by heavy, rapid footsteps as if a large animal, or even several, were in pursuit. Though the dense underbrush concealed our pursuer, we could feel the ground vibrate under the weight of swift strides. I screamed for everyone to run, trying not to let panic seep into my voice, but it came out as a cracked, terrified shout. We bolted, breaking into a run, stumbling over roots and stones, all the while dreading a glance behind us. The trail wound between the trees, and it seemed as if the pursuer could emerge from any shadowed corner. Several times I tempted myself to slow down and look back, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. The crunching of broken twigs, scraping sounds, and wailing did not subside, yet I continued to run, feeling as if my legs were filled with lead. As we rounded a bend that opened up to a view of the valley, I caught a glimpse of something resembling a wolf, but with elongated, sagging sides, or perhaps simply matted with clumps of dirty fur. The creature flashed briefly between the trees and then vanished. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or reality, but for a moment it seemed that the beast's face was missing a part, its bare maw glowing with a repulsive, rotting light. We kept running down the trail, our feet pounding on the gravel and earth, not caring about the path, only desperate to escape the danger. My legs burned, my head throbbed with pain, yet we couldn't stop. Darryl tried to encourage Judy, touching her shoulder so she wouldn't lag behind, while Ashley kept pace right behind me, breathing heavily. When the forest finally thinned and a wide clearing appeared ahead, I dared to look back. There was no one following, yet I still heard those terrible sounds in the distance, as if the creature hesitated to step into the open and was trailing us, hidden in the shadows of the trees. My heart pounded so fiercely I felt it in my throat. An aura of danger hung in the air as though nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of this fleeting chase. We knew that stopping was too risky, so we pressed on as long as we could. All the while, I felt as if the maddening gaze of that monstrous beast was still fixed on us, as if we were merely playthings in its grasp. By the end of the second day, we finally reached the vehicle parked at the mountain's base. None of us wanted to spend another night in a tent. We were too exhausted and terrified to face the woods again. As soon as we arrived, we left, desperate to escape the heavy memories. The journey back to town passed in a feverish silence. Once we reached civilization, we all went our separate ways, each hoping that time and the familiarity of everyday life would help erase the horrifying experience. That night, nightmares began to plague me. I saw distorted silhouettes and heard that same piercing howl. Sometimes it felt as if I had been thrust back into that dark forest, where every snapped twig foretold inevitable doom. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, convincing myself that the terror we endured was merely a result of fatigue and stress, perhaps amplified by the natural sounds of the wilderness. I hoped that I would eventually emerge from that state. But soon, news turned my already fragile equilibrium upside down. I stumbled upon a report on a local television news program. The anchor described horrifying murders that had occurred in several areas of our county in one single night. I couldn't fully comprehend what had happened until I heard familiar names. Ashley was mentioned first. She had been found in her home without a trace of blood, but with ghastly wounds on her skin. They said she was turned inside out, and no screams or signs of a struggle had been heard. Next was the couple, Daryl and Judy. They had been together in a small lakeside house and were found dead under brutally violent circumstances. The reporter's voice trembled as he described the scenes discovered by the police. I couldn't believe what was happening. It resembled a surreal horror film. I sat there paralyzed as images of Ashley, Daryl, and Judy from happier times flashed before my eyes. They had been full of life and dreams for the future, and then such a tragic end. One thought dominated my mind. We had brought something back from the forest that was more than a single horrifying apparition. I recalled all the legends of skinwalkers that had terrified us in town, and I realized with stark clarity that such brutality was beyond the capabilities of ordinary animals or people. There was something otherworldly at work here, something that fed on human fear and blood. In the days that followed, I barely left my home. I disconnected my phone because I couldn't bear the endless calls from acquaintances who were horrified by what had happened. No one directly linked the murders to our mountain trip, as the police officially attributed the incidents to a madman or a group of criminals, but I knew that things were not so simple. Each day, I delved deeper into research about supernatural beings, subjects I had previously encountered only in folklore chronicles. In libraries and archives, I found scattered references to ancient rituals, to people capable of transforming into animals, and thereby gaining inhuman strength and bloodlust. My eyes chilled at the vivid, horrifying descriptions. Some texts claimed that for these creatures, a victim's fear was a delicacy, a spice that further seasoned their cruelty. All this drove me into paranoia. I jumped at every sound behind the door, waking in cold sweats at night and sometimes suffering panic attacks. The darkness in my apartment seemed filled with hideous shadows just waiting to pounce. I began installing heavy-duty locks and an alarm system, though I suspected that no human means of protection could save me if it decided to come. I was convinced that our encounter in the forest had left an invisible mark on us all, and when fear reached its boiling point, the creature tore through those marks, leaving my friends in bloody agony. My life became an endless nightmare, for I knew that this monster, or ghost, or curse, however you might name it, continued to exist and was possibly already after me. No one could help, because no one would believe a story about a half-rotted wolf and ghastly howls in the night. Even if I found someone brave enough to listen, I doubted they would have the courage to confront such evil. My paranoia grew with each passing day, but the true horror began when inexplicable events started occurring in my home. At first, I noticed strange noises at night, soft knocks, as if someone were moving along the wall of the second floor. I lived in a detached house, and the windows in my bedroom overlooked the yard where there were no ladders or balconies. I couldn't fathom what could be scratching at my window, as it was physically impossible to reach without special equipment. Sometimes I saw a shadow gliding across the curtains that resembled a wolf's face, but it lasted only a second before vanishing, as if it were a figment of my exhausted mind. Gradually, I began hearing sounds that resembled voices from the past. Whether it was the wind carrying barely audible whispers or my imagination playing a cruel trick, I couldn't tell. Then one day I froze at the window when I heard a faint moan that shifted into a strange whisper, mimicking the intonation of my deceased friend Daryl. My heart tightened so much I nearly lost consciousness. The voice called my name, pleading for me to let it in, insisting that I must open the door because out there, it was dying from wounds. But my mind knew no one could bring Daryl back to life. It was an illusion, a trick. I struggled to hold back a scream, pressing my hands to my ears in an effort not to hear that repulsive voice, and instead, I distinctly felt the creak of the windowsill, as if clawed paws were scraping along the wood. For several nights in a row, I sat on the floor by my bed clutching a knife, even though I knew that such a cold weapon would hardly help if that creature decided to break in. The police did not take my calls seriously. A patrol once drove by, but naturally, they found nothing. Neighbors cast sidelong glances at me, thinking I was losing my mind after the loss of my friends. No one could believe the terrible truth, for it was easier to label the victim as insane than to accept that a real monster existed. Then one night, when I heard a scraping at the door, I realized that the climax was near. It wasn't just scratching. It was a forceful pressure, as if a large, powerful creature were pushing against the door. I imagined that on the other side stood that very monster, perhaps half man, half wolf, eager to finish its bloody work. In my mind, images of Ashley, Judy, and Daryl surfaced. They were all dead, and I was the only one left. What did this creature want? I felt an inexplicable impulse. Part of me wanted to fling the door open and end this nightmare in one swift motion. Yet another part, more instinctive, screamed at me to run, to flee while I still could. The whispers behind the door grew clearer, now mimicking Ashley's voice as if pleading for shelter. I rose, knowing I had to decide. Either I would surrender and open the door, letting the horror in, or I would try to run. Even though escape seemed futile because this creature was omnipresent and elusive, ready to catch us anywhere, my hand trembled as it gripped the knife. I took a step toward the door, internally resigning myself to the possibility that this might be my final act. Then everything was abruptly interrupted. I felt a sharp jolt, as if a burst of energy had ripped out of the darkness, stunning me. I was thrown backward, as though an unseen force repelled me from the door. In the ensuing moments, I saw nothing but darkness and heard nothing but my own breathing. And then suddenly all was silent. I stood in deep quiet, blinded and disoriented, too fearful to move. It seemed that on the other side of the door, too, silence had descended, as if the creature had vanished, dissolved into the air, leaving me in agonizing uncertainty. And so I remained in that dark corridor with a choice: to continue living in fear and fleeing, or to open the door to the unknown horror and end it all at once. I no longer cared whether anyone believed my story, for I knew the truth. The beings we feared in our childhood do exist, and they do not forgive if disturbed. What happens next? I can't even say. Left alone with this inexplicable evil. The decision had to be made in mere seconds, but my tale ends right here, where fear overwhelms reason and hope fades before ancient hatred. Perhaps I stepped forward and let the monster in, or perhaps I ran away. But one thing is certain: the end has not yet come, for the creature is still there, in the darkness, behind the thin walls of our familiar world. Story 3. I vividly remember that cool dawn when Grandpa Hank and I first stopped at the edge of a dense forest in the Appalachians. The air was damp and heavy, and the silence seemed to ring out, almost palpable. Occasionally, the cawing of crows echoed as they swooped down from the mighty trees whose tops were lost in the pre-dawn mist. I usually looked forward to our hunting trips. They gave me a sense of continuity, as if I were becoming part of a long-standing family tradition. But that day, I was overwhelmed by a strange, unsettling premonition, as if the nocturnal wind had whispered some unknown warning. I walked along the trail, gripping my rifle tightly, trying to appear confident and hide my unease. Grandpa walked a little ahead, his face set in a stone expression, almost as if he deliberately kept his distance to let me fully absorb what was happening. I knew his stern, yet caring nature, and I cherished every minute spent by his side. When I tried to ask why we had come to the forest at such an uncomfortable hour or express doubts about the hunt, he would only shake his head and gaze off into the distance as if recalling something heavy and distant. I had no idea then what secrets he harbored. We ventured deeper into the thicket. Wet leaves rustled underfoot, and the occasional raindrop left a cold dampness on my clothes. In the Appalachians, the forest always seemed both serene and ominous. The thought that a beast might leap from every shadow, or that something otherworldly could suddenly appear, made my heart pound faster. At times, it even seemed as though the branches of the trees bowed lower than usual, as if whispering something indistinct. Even the most familiar sounds, a snapping twig or a gust of wind, became eerie signals. We stopped in a small clearing between the trees, and I noticed Grandpa tensing as he listened intently to sounds that I couldn't make out. He ran his hand over the greasy leather loop of his old rifle's sling, as if trying to regain his usual calm. Old legends about these woods spoke of spirits and mysterious creatures best left undisturbed. But Hank never mocked such tales. On the contrary, he would embellish them with details, making them chillingly believable. Now, being here in the very heart of the forest with him, I almost physically felt that within every fold of the mist could hide something far more sinister than an ordinary woodland animal. We continued along the well-worn hunting trail, braving the wind as we moved quietly and, as always, with cautious alertness. When up ahead I caught sight of several silhouettes, I assumed they were deer, graceful, majestic creatures. Strangely, they didn't scatter immediately. They only watched us warily. One buck stood slightly apart, tilting his head as if trying to meet my gaze. I pressed my cheek against the cool stock of my rifle, waiting for a signal from Grandpa. But he didn't move. Usually Hank knew exactly when to give the order to shoot, yet now something clearly had set him on edge. The buck in front of us looked unusual. His eyes flared with a frightening, almost hypnotic fire that sent a chill through my veins. As I tried to steady my breathing, everything around me seemed to freeze. The deer stared at us, and we, in turn, fixed our gaze upon them. Suddenly, the buck took a step forward, and his chest rose in a strange manner, as if the beast were holding back a roar or a pained groan. I caught Hank's eye. He made it clear that now was not the time to fire. As if in response to some unseen presence deep within the thicket, the deer suddenly bolted, disappearing behind the trees. My heart pounded, and I struggled to understand what had frightened the herd so badly. It felt as though we had both become mere pawns in a game orchestrated by a force far more powerful. I moved closer to Grandpa. He didn't seem angry, but rather deeply troubled. Then I recalled his old tale about a friend named Jimmy, who had mysteriously vanished in this very forest many years ago. I had once thought those stories were just bedtime scares to keep me in line, but now everything took on a far more sinister meaning. Without a word, Grandpa pressed on, and I could only follow. We tried tracking the deer, but they had gone too far. However, where they had stood, I noticed deep impressions in the ground. Strange, alien prints, as if hooves had suddenly morphed into something entirely different. A shiver ran down my spine. It felt as if we had come face to face with a creature that took on a deer's form merely to observe. The oppressive silence between Hank and me deepened, making me feel even more vulnerable. I sensed that behind every tree could be something that rendered even childhood ghost stories insignificant. For a time, the rain had ceased, leaving behind a heavy dampness and the scent of decaying leaves. We resumed our walk along the trail, still trying to follow the deer, although deep inside, I knew our hunt had transformed into something altogether abnormal. A light mist began to creep along the ground, and each of our footsteps echoed among the trunks, as if the forest itself was trying to send a message from its depths that we were nearing its heart. After a while, we came upon an overturned, rotten stump and strangely disturbed vegetation beneath it. Deep grooves in the moist earth and scattered bark fragments hinted at the presence of a clawed creature of unimaginable size. Nearby trees bore scratch marks as if marking its territory. When I ran my hand over one of them, I was struck by its depth. It seemed that a powerful beast roamed these parts. Grandpa examined every detail with tense concentration, and in his eyes, I read the understanding of something that had long troubled him. My growing sense of dread intensified when I thought I saw a shadow flicker behind a thick pine, a shape reminiscent of a wolf on its hind legs, but with unnervingly human contours. The forest filled with rustling, the cracking of branches and gusts of wind, within which I faintly discerned otherworldly sounds. I looked at Grandpa. He silently pressed a finger to his lips, signaling that we needed to be extremely cautious. Before my eyes, the tragic story of Jimmy, how he had vanished long ago, surfaced. Back then, all that was found were scraps of clothing and footprints leading deep into the woods. No one could adequately explain what had happened. People dismissed it as the work of a wild animal, but Grandpa knew there was something more. Now, standing beside these ominous marks and scratches, I realized just how intertwined those old legends were with our fate. The forest was becoming a living, hungry entity, ready to reveal its true nature. And as twilight deepened, the feeling that it was our turn to confront the horror we had only ever heard about in scary stories grew ever stronger. Night fell suddenly, as if someone had switched off the celestial light. We managed to set up a small camp in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their thick branches arching overhead like gateways to another realm. The claw marks and scratches we had discovered earlier that day haunted my thoughts. It seemed as though the forest came alive with the onset of darkness, attuned to our every movement. I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, straining to listen to the endless nocturnal symphony, the rustling of leaves, the infrequent patter of raindrops, the howling wind. Together, these sounds formed an eerie melody. Suddenly, somewhere far off, an owl hooted, and after that abrupt sound, the forest fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. I realized then that silence could be far more terrifying than any rustle. After what felt like an eternity, I heard cautious shuffling near the side of my tent. At first, I assumed it was a raccoon or possum, but then came the scraping of claws. A cold terror gripped me. The sound was as if a large predator was circling our shelter, assessing who might be hiding inside. I slowly reached for my knife and glanced at Grandpa. He lay still, but it was clear he was tense to the breaking point. Soon, I distinctly heard heavy breathing or low moans right behind the fabric. My heart thundered, and I tried to breathe as silently as possible. Suddenly, Grandpa stirred, and I saw in his eyes something terrifyingly primal, as if a beastly essence was awakening within him. I didn't have time to understand what was happening before the fabric of the tent buckled under some unseen pressure. I instinctively recoiled, and at that very moment Hank snapped out of his trance, grabbed my shoulder, and pointed toward an exit. No words were needed. We had to run. We emerged from the tent into the cold wind and drizzling rain. In the beam of my flashlight, for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something both lupine and human, distorted and repulsive. It vanished just as quickly as it appeared. We bolted into the dark thicket, pursued by the chilling sensation that some unknown creature was breathing down our necks. Mud squelched underfoot. Branches whipped across my face. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. Grandpa panted heavily, occasionally glancing back. We ran as if through viscous darkness, every step sending pain through our legs. I heard a low, guttural roar behind me that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded so fiercely that I thought I could feel it in my throat. We struggled to discern our surroundings through the dense night forest, knowing roughly where the country road lay, though the darkness had distorted all our bearings. Finally, when it seemed we could run no longer, we saw the faint glow of headlights from an old pickup on a small clearing. Reaching the vehicle, we slammed the doors and started the engine. In the headlight's beam, a wolf-like silhouette arched in an unnatural pose appeared. But within moments that shadow dissolved into the night. The wheels splashed up mud as the truck roared onto the country road. I felt as if we had slipped from the very heart of a nightmare. Yet a bitter realization gnawed at me. This encounter was inevitable, as if a shadow had been haunting our family for generations. Grandpa gripped the steering wheel, clenching his teeth, and I saw his hands trembling. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming fear for him. Perhaps the same darkness that had taken Jimmy had left its mark on Hank's soul. Did he fear that he, too, might one day lose his humanity? At last, we stopped at a fork in the road, where a narrow dirt track gave way to a wider highway. I looked at Grandpa. For a long moment, he didn't let go of the wheel, breathing heavily. It seemed he was trying to decide whether I was ready to learn the whole truth. When he finally switched off the headlights, the night swallowed us again, and I realized that the darkness was not only outside the vehicle, but also within us. Grandpa began to recount how he had once lost his friend Jimmy in a similarly foggy forest. all while hearing a mounting howl. No one had ever been able to explain the disappearance of that hunter. Only fragments of clothing and strange tracks were found, mysteries that remained unsolved. Now, standing beside those ominous marks and scratches, I understood how tightly those legends had woven themselves into our destiny. The forest was becoming a living, ravenous entity, ready at any moment to reveal its true nature. And as the twilight deepened, it became ever more apparent that our turn to face that which we had only heard of in terrifying stories had come. Night had fallen completely by then. We managed to set up a small camp in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their thick branches forming archways that seemed to lead into another world. The marks we had found earlier haunted my thoughts. It was as if the forest awakened with the darkness, listening to our every move. I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, listening to the endless nocturnal symphony. The rustle of leaves, the occasional patter of rain, the moaning wind. All of it melded into an eerie melody. Suddenly, somewhere far away, an owl hooted, and then the forest fell into a suffocating silence. I realized that silence could be far more terrifying than any sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a cautious rustling near the tent's wall. At first I assumed it was a raccoon or possum, but then came the scraping of claws. A cold horror gripped me. The sound was as if a large predator was circling our shelter, trying to figure out who was hiding inside. I slowly reached for my knife and glanced at Grandpa. He lay still, yet I could see he was as tense as ever. Before long, I distinctly heard heavy breathing, or perhaps moaning, right behind the fabric. My heart pounded furiously as I tried to breathe as quietly as possible. Suddenly, Grandpa stirred, and I saw in his eyes something shockingly primordial, as if a beastly essence had awoken within him. I barely had time to register what was happening before the tent's fabric bulged under unseen pressure. I instinctively recoiled, and at that moment, Hank seemed to snap out of his trance. He grabbed my shoulder and pointed toward the exit. No words were needed. We had to run. We scrambled out of the tent into the cold wind and drizzling rain. In the beam of my flashlight, for an instant I caught sight of something that was at once wolf-like and human, distorted and repulsive. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared. We fled into the dark thicket, pursued by the feeling that some unknown creature was literally breathing down our necks. Mud squelched underfoot. Branches whipped against our faces. I stumbled, barely managing to keep upright. Grandpa panted heavily, glancing back every so often. We ran as if through a viscous gloom, every step sending agony through our legs. I heard a low, resonant roar behind me that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded so fiercely I could almost feel it in my throat. We scarcely knew where we were in the labyrinth of night, only roughly aware of the direction of the country road, as the dark forest distorted every landmark. Finally, when we thought we could run no further, we saw the faint glow of headlights from an old pickup on a small clearing. Once we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors and started the engine. In the headlights, a wolf-like silhouette arched in an unnatural pose flickered by, but within moments, that shadow melted away into the night. The truck's wheels splashed up mud as it roared onto the country road. I felt as if we had escaped from the very heart of a nightmare. Yet a bitter awareness lingered. This encounter had been inevitable, as if a shadow had been haunting our family for generations. Grandpa gripped the steering wheel with clenched teeth, and I saw his hands tremble. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming fear for him. Perhaps the same darkness that took Jimmy had left its mark on Hank's soul. Did he fear that he, too, might one day lose his humanity? Eventually, we pulled over at a fork where a narrow dirt road merged into a wider highway. I looked at Grandpa, who clutched the wheel for a long moment, breathing heavily. It seemed he was deciding whether I was ready to learn the whole truth. When he finally switched off the headlights, the night swallowed us again, and I realized that the darkness was not only outside the vehicle, but inside us as well. Grandpa began recounting how, long ago, he had lost his friend Jimmy in a similarly foggy forest while hearing an ever-growing howl. No one had ever been able to explain the disappearance of that hunter. Only scraps of clothing and strange tracks were found, leaving the mystery unsolved. Now, standing beside those ominous marks and scratches, I understood how deeply these legends were interwoven with our fate. The forest was turning into a living, ravenous being, ready at any moment to reveal its true nature. And as the twilight deepened, it became increasingly clear that our turn to confront the horror we had only ever heard of in scary stories had come. We spent a few more minutes in the pickup as if hoping that if we just froze and stayed still, the nocturnal nightmare might dissipate. But I knew that there was no escaping what we had seen. Finally, Grandpa started the engine, and we drove toward the lights of a nearby town, lights that promised a false sense of security. Yet I knew deep down that in the heart of the Appalachians, an ancient power slumbered, ready to remind us of its presence at any moment. It could not be placated or fooled. It could only delay the inevitable. I continue to live with the memory of that night when Hank and I stared into the eyes of that darkness and narrowly escaped. And every evening, in the soft whispers of the wind, I hear the echo of a distant howl, a warning that this story is far from over.